Here we go.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second instalment of our Grow Wild Winter Training Series. 2 weeks ago, we did a session on nature journaling, which was all about exploring how you could use this tool to improve our nature connection, as well as the well-being benefits and developing our observational skills. But today we are going to be further developing some of our observational skills, as well as having a bit more of a knowledge-based session. This will all linked in with the building on the nature connection and more quality time spent in nature to improve our well-being. So today, our session is on identifying and understanding fungi, which is going to be absolutely perfect if you're a beginner, but if you're a bit more experienced, there's something for everyone in this session, and I really think you're in for an absolute treat. So I hope you're all sitting comfortably and you're very warm, or just mediumly warm. Get ready to join us for the wonders of the fungi world with Mark Williams. Next slide, please. So first up, though, I will introduce myself and the other half of the double act. My name's Isha Teku, and I'm the Grow Wild Engagement and Training Assistant here at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. My role encompasses all sorts of things, including some training and youth project grants, supports, where I really do have the best job in the world. But more recently, we've had fungi lab drive, and I've been working very closely with that. So all sorts of different things. But we're also joined behind the scenes doing all the tech with Chloe Booth. Chloe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there, thanks Isha. Yes, as Isha's already mentioned, my name's Chloe and I'm the Grow Wild Engagement and Training Officer. So Isha and I work really closely together, predominantly on a lot of our grant programs, particularly for young people and also for community projects. But yes, we do all kinds of things, as Isha's already mentioned, but it's great to be here tonight. And yes, I'll be behind the scenes doing some of the tech and also keeping an eye on our event Q&A that you can enter any comments or questions into as we go through the session tonight.
Brilliant. So we'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who are not familiar with Teams or would like a reminder. This session is going to be recorded and the recording will be out next week if you would like to go back and see any sections. If you want to go and, I don't know, send this to all your friends and family, I'm sure you will do. Yeah, the YouTube recording will be up next week. Now, this is a Q&A session, and I'm sure you're going to have loads of wonderful questions, but we ask you to ask any of these questions in the Q&A box, which you can find at the top of your screen. There is a question mark in 2 speech bubbles. If you click on this, you can type in your question here. Now, we do ask that you don't say anything inappropriate and don't put any personal information or identifiable information into this. All the questions do get monitored and checked and published, so if you do any of that, then they just won't get published. And of course, we would like everyone to see them, as we are a great little community here. If you would like to turn on the live captions to have subtitles as we go through the talk, then again, at the top of your screen, you can press 3 buttons. It will come up with a list. Down at the bottom of the list, there is a button that says turn on live captions. And finally, if you've got any concerns during or after the session, then you can contact us on our main inbox, which is hello@growwilduk.com. So that is enough of the necessary but slightly more boring stuff. We will get on to the more juicy stuff from now. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our very special guest this evening, Mark Williams, who is the owner of Galloway Wild Foods, which is a Scottish-based business aiming to connect and inspire people to the natural world through foraging. Mark has a huge wealth of knowledge about fungi, and we are so happy that he's here today to talk with us about fungi. I will pass over to you now, Mark, if you would like to say, well, continue on.
Thanks very much, Isha, and thank you so much for having me. I feel kind of honoured to be working with you guys and with Kew Gardens. I'm you know, my love and connection and knowledge about fungi has kind of come to me organically through exploring in the woods So yeah, I haven't studied it as a science, but I very much enjoy sharing what I have picked up in about, I don't know, 30 years being a bit obsessed with mushrooms. So
amazing. Can you remember the first point where you got excited about fungi and mushrooms, Mark? Was there any defining moment?
yeah, well, we just I was working split shifts in a restaurant on a little Scottish island called Arran, where I grew up, and just to kill the 2 hours between split shifts in the restaurant, we were surrounded by lovely woodland, so we would go out and just see what we could find and try and identify them. But we didn't really have any particularly good books at the time or any knowledge or anything, so it was a bit of a guessing game. And of course, that was 30 years ago. There wasn't much in the way of internet back then. So yeah, it was. I still try and remember those times when I'm kind of, you know, trying to teach people who are new to the subject of fungi about how daunting and massive it is and how much there is to know. And it's also about knowing how much there is to know as well as what you can know, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, we all know there's a lot out there, and I know you're going to cover some really great content for us today, but just to say, this is going to be a taster and a sort of a tip of the iceberg, isn't it, Mark, of what the wealth of knowledge you've got, and we'll be giving you some great links onto some further information, both on Mark's own website and some more training resources that Mark's got as well, and also things you can pick up through the Grow Wild site too at the end. So yeah. This is to get you excited.
Yeah, I was really excited to be asked, and then when you said we've got about 35 minutes for you, and we'd like you to cover this, I was like, oh! Yeah. But no, we can certainly get a feel for what's going on here.
Yeah, cool. Okay, should we get going?
Yes, let's start with the slides. Chloe's doing the slides, and I will just go to forward them on.
Blame me if it all goes wrong. Oh no! Yeah. Here we go.
Yeah, so I've called this bit of understanding fungi. The part of fungi that we naturally connect with is mushrooms, I suppose, isn't it? That's the things that we see above the ground. But really, to understand the kind of wider kingdom of fungi, you have to kind of go down to the microscopic level, and that's why, in a way, why it's quite hard to really get to know fungi easily and quickly. We'll cover some easy wins as we go along, but yeah, so to understand fungi, you have to understand what's going on beneath those mushrooms when they're growing, and the key to that is in this photograph, which I love. What we're seeing there is the base of the stems of two mushrooms and this magical stuff from which they grow, which is fungi. The mushrooms that we see, as we'll see talk about later on, are just the reproductive structures that's created by this amazing network that we call mycelium. And this is the super fine threads that run through all sorts of living and organic tissue, through wood, and especially dead wood and organics, compost and grass and soil, and it's pretty much everywhere. If you walk out in your garden or in a park or in the woods, it's under your feet all the time, and it's extremely dense. And this picture shows how it all kind of coalesces to form mushrooms, but it's these networks of mycelium that are the key to understanding fungi. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll have a little closer look. Yeah, so yeah, the vast majority of recorded fungi form these networks called mycelium, and there's an electron scanning microscope view in the background there that's just showing the kind of complexity and density of mycelium. There's all sorts of statistics around the density of these super fine threads, but those strands that you're seeing there are less than 1/10 the diameter of a human hair, which is kind of fairly hard to visualize, but they're running in between kind of grains of sand or soil, and they're also thin enough and narrow enough to permeate the cell walls and actually go through wood. So they're super fine, and this is one of the challenges because they're hard to see with the naked eye, and you generally need a microscope to be able to see them. This mycelium is actually comprised of even smaller little filaments called hyphae, and they're the kind of building blocks of the mycelium. But mycelium is the term we use for that general mass of cobwebby-like networks that are around us and in all sorts of organic matter around us all the time. If we go on to the next slide, I've got an example of how you could probably go out and see some of mycelium quite easily. Oh no, sorry, I'm forgetting which slide's coming up. So this is actually, we've grabbed this off YouTube. It's a public access video, but it's an electron scanning video, if you want to just start it, of mycelium growing. So these super fine strands, and you can actually see them growing. You might have seen some photographs of petri dishes with molds growing out of them. Well, they are growing with these super fine strands. So you can see them forking and branching and forming these complex networks. And I always think it looks quite like computer circuitry, you know, if you look at a circuit board or something like that. And the really interesting thing to see here is how they cross, they join with these little cross hatchings as well. So these filaments are reaching out, feeling for food, and inside this one you can actually see fluids or cells moving along, so they can send messages and they can feel, and and they're on the hunt for food. So really lovely to see them growing.
I mean, obviously this is very sped up, Mark, but do you know, is it fast growing? Does mycelium grow quickly? Do we know?
Yeah, it can be relative to, say, like the way a plant's roots might grow or something like that, but this is definitely sped up. So we were talking some of these images, if you want to go on to the next slide now, actually. Yeah. Some of these images are, yeah, considerably sped up. So yeah, you would, but you know, like a petri dish can fill up with some species of fungi with their mycelia in a matter of days or even hours, and others might be slower growing. So yeah, it's pretty quick though compared to plants. I brought this picture up because I think this is a really nice way that people can actually go out. Even now we're into December, there's not loads of mushrooms to see at the moment, but there's a really common parasitic fungus called honey fungus. And it's a really good way of getting a kind of idea of mycelium without having a microscope or even a magnifying glass. And this is, if you look on dead trees, behind the bark, especially of dead and fallen trees in woodland, especially deciduous trees, you'll quite often see these really complex black strands. These are called rhizomorphs, and this is what happens when the mycelia of honey fungus coalesces to form these larger kind of branching fronds, so it can travel larger distances. But if, in a way, I think of this when I'm teaching children, I bring a load of this along because it kind of dries out on the trees and you can just peel it off. And it's almost like we've thrown a microscope over mycelium, and you can see some of that kind of complexity of how these superfine strands interact on the microscopic level as well. But these are the size of you know, those licorice strands that you would buy in a sweetie shop or something. So they look a lot like that. Yeah, yeah. Don't try eating them. They're a bit tough and leathery. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But not at all rare. This is a very common mushroom, so it's a really good way to get that sense of the complexity of mycelium, but on a slightly more macro level. Yeah. If we go on to the next slide. So yeah, so you've seen those beautiful images of those reaching strands of the hyphal tips of mycelium, and so what makes fungi is a really good question. How does it differ from a plant or an animal or something like that? And there are some pretty scientific technical answers to that, but we're going to just focus on one today, and that is their eating habit. How do they obtain their nutrition to grow? How do these mycelial networks grow? They don't photosynthesize like plants or engulf food like we eat food and digest it internally. What they do very cleverly is they secrete enzymes from their growing tips, and that sort of digests the food externally from the mycelia, and then it's reabsorbed into the mycelium and then moved away. So it not only is it a sort of feeding aperture, but it's also a transportation network. So anything it absorbs, it can move around. And when that signal goes into that network, it can grow in directions. So you can think of these mycelia as sometimes as tracking down sort of food sources that they can digest. And you know, they exhibit certain types of intelligence in terms of tracking down food and things like that. So yeah, really extraordinary things.
Yeah, fascinating.
That's really cool. Yeah. Matt, we had a question about what the difference is between a mushroom and a toadstool. I'm wondering if that is the right place to ask that.
This comes up a lot, and there is technically no scientific difference between a mushroom and a toadstool. Toadstool is, I suppose, what people generally think of as a poisonous mushroom. whereas mushroom is used for things that are maybe edible. But it's a very colloquialized term. It has no scientific meaning at all. And you know, mycologists will talk about toadstools or mushrooms or, you know, sporocarps or all sorts of different terminology, but it doesn't really mean anything. And I suppose the idea of using toadstools to mean poisonous mushrooms means that you need to know what a poisonous mushroom looks like, and they look very, very different, and you know, so it's not a very useful term at all. They're used very much interchangeably.
Brilliant.
I have written a whole blog on my website about mushrooms and toadstools. What is the difference? That kind of a greater lens. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So pop on to the next slide now. Yeah, so that secreting of enzymes by these complex networks and then reabsorption and moving things around is a key thing to think about. And I just wanted to talk briefly about how the different nutritional lifestyles for fungi, because they don't all absorb their food in the same ways. We've got some interesting things here. We've got leaf rotting fungi. We've got one growing out of an insect there, one that's growing in association with plants, and even one there where they have actually myceliated a corpse. Apparently this is a mock-up, there isn't actually a dead body in there, to actually reabsorb the nutrients from humans. And there's definitely a lot of discussion now about myceliating coffins so that our remains are more quickly broken down by fungi and returned into the ecosystems. So yeah, kind of slightly gory, but also slightly fascinating. I think that one. So we'll have break down a few of these sort of fungal, what I call nutritional lifestyles or eating habits with fungi, I suppose, in the next slides. If you want to go on one. Yeah, so I don't want to use too much terminology, but so one type of fungi would be what we call lignicolous saprotrophs. But anyway, wood rotters will do. You can see I can hardly even say it. These are the things that are breaking down dead wood. And of course, after these big storms that we've had lately, certainly up here in Scotland, where I am, there's a lot of fallen wood. And, you know, that's, you know, kind of challenging for forest ecosystems, but also brings lots of opportunities for fungi. And these wood rotters are breaking it down. Their mycelium is permeating through all this fallen wood and breaking it down, and it's forming brown rot and white rot. Fungi is one of the only things that can break down lignin in wood, and lignin is the compound that makes wood really hard. That's me knocking my desk, sorry. Nobody at the door. And so without fungi to break that down, we'd just be buried in all the fallen wood if we were in forests and things like that. Of course, that's not something you want to have in your house. Dry rot, of course, or any kind of rot in the timbers of your house is really problematic, but it's actually really important in terms of breaking down fallen wood and returning it into the nutrient cycle, especially in forests. Yeah, so if we go on to the next slide, then we have another difficult term, humiculous saprotrophs, or leaf rotters is a good way of thinking of these guys. So these are the guys that that are digesting all that leaf litter, all that finer matter, maybe really rich organic soil, or are growing next to your compost heap or something like that, and again breaking it down. In the top left image there, that's another way. I showed you the rhizomorphs of honey fungus earlier on, but another way you can see mycelium at work, just like when you're out observing and walking in the woods, is sometimes if you kind of move a pile of leaves, you'll see these fine cottony strands, like in the top left photo there. So that's a nice way to kind of connect with mycelium, and take that home and get a magnifying glass out, and you'll see these really complex networks feeling their way over the plant surface and breaking it down. And then of course later on, when these things have got enough, have digested enough, they'll start to form their reproductive structures like the mushrooms. But we'll come to the mushrooms later. That's just a tease. We're still talking about mycelium and how they're eating. Okay, if you want to go on to the next slide. So yeah, that's two fungal nutritional lifestyles, and then we come to the third, and one of the most fascinating, I think, and this is what we call the mycorrhizal fungi. So sounds like a bit of a long, complex word. It comes from the Greek word myco, which means mushroom or fungus, and rhiza, which means root, is a Greek for root. So they come together, and that's exactly what it describes. Is a mycorrhizal relationship describes when the mycelium connects and sheathes around the very fine roots of vascular plants, trees, grasses, And 80% of plants are known to have some sort of relationship with a mycorrhizal fungi. It's an incredibly common relationship and incredibly important, but until the last 20 or so years, virtually invisible kind of relationship. It's very hard to see that mycelium and how it entwines in the relationships it forms with plants. So yeah, we'll have a little closer look at that, how that works now.
I think, Mark, I read somewhere that I think it was a particular orchid can't germinate without a particular fungi being present in the soil, or something like that. I read in terms of that relationship being so vital.
Yeah, these are extraordinarily complex relationships, and they're also really ancient. The earliest plants didn't really have roots at all. They had symbiosis with fungi. So actually relationships with fungi became before roots. You know, these simple algae teamed up with fungi to form the beginnings of life on Earth. So yeah, really very complex relationships going on there. And of course it's species specific. It's not like any mycelia from any species of fungi can hang out with any mycelia from any species of plant. That quite often these are very intimate relationships, very kind of closely bound. Although, as we'll see, there's maybe a slide later on that makes this a bit clearer. Some mycelia are what I call multilingual, and that means they will trade or join with a variety of different partner plants, so they can go cross species. So I think of it like trading, traders in the Mediterranean maybe, and they can speak a little bit of Greek and a little bit of Moroccan, and you know, they can speak lots of different languages and trade with all these different plant partners. So, but others are very loyal and would only stay with one type of plant partner.
Great.
Yeah, I've got some slides coming up that show a little bit more about that relationship. Yeah, so this is kind of puts a bit more audio on that. It's a lovely pair of images. On the left is a Scots pine sapling with just its roots showing. So it's just a little sapling trying to make its way in the world. And if that's all the roots it's got to absorb all its nutrition and all its water supply. But on the right, if that has a mycorrhizal fungi growing with it, the appropriate mycorrhizal fungi, look at how much more densely packed that soil is, and all that mycelium is absorbing water, nutrients, breaking down, digesting things, and then but sheathing around those fine roots of the tree and trading with it as well. So really important. In fact, if you in the forestry plantations and things like that, they inoculate the saplings, pre-inoculate them with appropriate mycelia. And I'm sure gardeners are becoming quite aware of how useful having, you know, healthy mycorrhizal relationships in their soil is if they're trying to grow good plants and vegetables. And go to the next slide, we'll have a closer look at this relationship. Yeah. So this is a little sort of, there's a few transitions in this. I hope it's not too jumpy for folk at home, but yeah, this shows we've got our mushroom or our fungi on the left for those that mycelia, and our plant on the right. And in this relationship, try to break down what each element brings to it. So the fungi trades with its plant partner, and it is trading. This is not some altruistic thing, although, you know, it's nice to think about that. Potentially, maybe that is happening too. But the fungi is giving to the plant nitrogen, and sometimes that can be as much as 80% of what a plant requires. Some trees will not reach maturity unless they have appropriate mycorrhizal partners. That's known for sure. Things like phosphorus, the fungi mycelium is very good at taking that up, and other minerals that tree roots aren't so good at, but those fine feeling probing things of tentacles of mycelium are good at getting, and of course, probably most importantly of all, water. So really increasing the plant's water uptake, and that becomes extremely useful. We had a really unusually hot, long summer up in Scotland this year. Doesn't happen often, but it actually resulted in lots and lots of mushrooms appearing when autumn came, when it finally rained, because the mycelium had been trading very heavily with the plants and getting lots back, because the trees had been very thirsty, if that makes sense. So we'll see what the fungi goes back. If you press the forward key, we'll see what goes the other way. Yeah, so going back in this relationship, the plant is giving basically carbon in the form of simple sugars back to the fungi, and that also means that mycelium is incredibly important carbon sink as well. So healthy, we talk about healthy forests, but that implicit in that is the health of this complex, vast mycelial network beneath that forest. So yeah, amazing relationships. So yes, and then if we scale that up, this term came up, I don't know, 20 years or so ago. Not quite sure who coined it first, but it was made popular by a mycologist called Paul Stamets, called the Wood Wide Web. It's a lovely kind of catchy term that really does justice to the complexity of these mycorrhizal relationships. And I like this image because there's lots of trees. And we've got different species of trees, and then we're seeing the roots, and then we're seeing all these interconnections and interplay with the fungi connecting things. So one tree can transmit compounds to its offspring. Dying trees can sink their lots of their nutrients into their roots and then into the mycelium, which can then transmit it onto their offspring. And they found that there's lots of cross-species trading between the plants using the mycelium. So I sometimes describe mycelium as like ecosystem services for forests. They are the plumbing, and they are the internet and the Wood Wide Web for forests. So yeah.
Fantastic. Can tree diseases get spread as well through mycelium, Mark? Is that something that happens, or is it tend to be beneficial things?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's important to say, first of all, that not all fungi are going to be beneficial to all trees. We also have parasitic fungi. That they come in the sort of wood rotting style. The honey fungus we mentioned earlier on can kill off the tree. But I'm not aware of actual pathogens being passed, using that. But it wouldn't surprise me at all. Maybe some of your mycologists at Kew are doing some fascinating research into that at the moment.
Something we can ask them, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one of the great things about this, because so much of this world of mycelium has been invisible from us up until really the last 20, maybe 30 years, it's been really hidden. So there's so much to discover where, plants are a little bit clearer about what's been going on. We have a longer history with them because we have this really tactile relationship with them. But because of this hidden nature, that we're discovering new things all the time. So yeah, not sure about that one though. Just to add a little bit, I don't want to, I think you've probably got the sense of this, but this is a great map that I found, and this is a survey of a 30 by 30 square meter area, and the green splodges are trees, and they only surveyed one type of tree, Douglas fir, and 2 fungi species that are associated with Douglas fir, and it's showing all the linkages between them. And it shows the most highly connected tree, then the bottom right there, which linked to 47 other trees via 11 different fungal mycelia. So this is like complex, and nutrients and messages can be passed through this network. So yeah, really complicated. Next slide, please. So that's the sort of the invisible stuff that you have to try and. Yeah, it's really great if you can get all that idea of mycelium into your head and just run that through your head as you're walking through the forest, and it's just magical. But it is mostly hidden, and of course, how we connect with mycelium and with fungi is through their reproductive structures. So we're going to have a little look at them now. We're a little bit late in the season. Down in the south, you may still see some interesting mushroom in the woods. Most of ours have been washed away by the storms up here now and the frosts. But you may still see something, and there are some winter fungi that appear as well. So if you're out looking, so if you go on to the next slide, we'll have a look through some of these different reproductive structures. The fungal kingdom is actually broken down into 2 kind of broad areas. This is the higher fungi, the visible fungi that we can connect with. Don't forget, there are millions of tiny little microscopic ones that you wouldn't even see, and you wouldn't even see any fruit body. But in terms of these larger bodies that we can actually start to connect with, they're broken down into how they get their spores into the air. Spores are best thought of like the seeds of a plant. They're tiny little grains of the genetic material of the fungi, And every time you see any kind of mushroom or fungal structure above ground, its entire purpose for being there is to get these spores into the air. Think of them like little clouds, and every time you breathe, you're breathing in these superfine spores. Don't be alarmed by that, it's quite safe. We've been doing it since we evolved, so yeah, it's all fine. And so those spore-bearing structures are broken down into two broad groups: the Ascomycota, and these are fungi that actually shoot their spores into the air. And this includes lots of things like tiny little yeasts and molds. If you get a moldy lemon in your fruit bowl, happens to be far too often, I'm afraid, and they go a little bit blue, and sometimes you touch it and there's this little cloud comes off it. That is the spores from that mold on a lemon. Don't want to give you too much insight into my kitchen, but so yeah, these things actively shoot their spores into the air. And this is things like the cup fungi. We've got this beautiful one that actually appears in winter in the bottom left called the scarlet, or there's another one called the ruby elf cup, and they're cup shaped. And they will basically, if you breathe on them at the right moment when their spores are ready to go, if you breathe on them and you're changing the air pressure, you're not blowing, but you're just changing the humidity in the air, they will actually almost twitch and they will shoot a little cloud of magical spores into the air. You can actually see it with the naked eye. So yeah, these are the spore shooters that are actively ejecting their spores into the air. A good one that you could probably still find in the woods just now is this one, candle snuff fungus. Looks like little wicks of candles on the floor. And if you haven't had a heavy frost near you, it might still be viable and you'll usually find it on old tree stumps. And if you actually just touch that one, you'll sometimes see it'll react. It's not like you're pinging the spores off, but it actually kind of feels the movement and then goes pew and shoots off little clouds, and it looks like you've just put out a candle. So that's worth looking for just now. So that's the Ascomycota, the spore shooters. And then the next one on the next slide is the Basidiomycota. And these drop their spores, and this is the way of getting spores into the air that is most tightly bound with what we think of as a classic mushroom or toadstool shape. Okay, the umbrella shape, and everything about that umbrella shape has evolved to get spores into the air. So it's got a protective barrier on top, a cap, and then under the cap there is something like slats or gills, which increases that surface area, and that is where these spores are dropped from. And of course the stem is just to lift all that up off the ground so they can catch these fine tiny air currents and be carried away to other areas to colonize. So yeah, that's the spore droppers. This is most of the mushrooms that you would probably encounter, all the sort of mushroom shaped mushrooms that we think of.
I was cooking some mushrooms for my tea yesterday after we'd been planning this session, and I was not thinking about them in the same way. I have to say, I was looking at them a lot more closely.
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting, you can get a sense of spores if you're cooking. If you go to a shop and you look at different types of mushroom, you get the little button mushroom, and then you get the one that, what do they call them, breakfast mushroom with the open cap. And if you look at they're actually the same species of cultivated mushroom, Agaricus bisporus usually, and they're the little ones are at a really early stage and they haven't opened their cap fully and haven't displayed and started dropping their spores yet. So they have pink gills, and as the spores mature, they go dark brown. And that's when your great big other mushrooms, you cook them, everything goes quite brown, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
That's the spores that's coming out of the cap of the mature mushroom. So
wow,
another way
definitely not going to think about them the same now.
Yeah, I'm not putting anyone off. That's, next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm just going to go through some of the reproductive structures of these things, because this is starting with number one, obviously mushrooms and toadstools. I'm glad we broke the difference or lack of difference between those terms down earlier on. So this describes the basic umbrella shaped mushroom, more or less umbrella shaped. The photo in the middle of the bottom, that's a mushroom called orange birch bolete. And I'm holding my hand there just to demonstrate the lengths that mushrooms will go to keep their spore dropping cap perpendicular to the ground. So you can actually see this has been growing out of a banking, and it's kind of come out, maybe something moved and it's grown out down the way, but they have their inbuilt spirit level, or maybe they sense light. I'm not quite sure how they do it. And then that stem has then grown in a big curve and presented its cap so it can drop its spores And if that was at an angle, the spores wouldn't drop out naturally. So I really like that picture. It's also like a smiley face mushroom, isn't it? Next slide, please. So yeah, other fruit body forms, and this will be fairly familiar to some people, is the puffballs. That's my daughter in the bottom right there, holding a giant puffball the size of her head. And in these, the spores mature within a sac-like structure, and then it breaks open and they puff their spores into the air by various means. That's a great one of the smoke. It looks like almost like smoke, these super fine pores coming out. So that's the puffballs. Next slide, please. And then we have the stinkhorns. These are the smelly mushrooms that erupt from what's called a witch's egg. The common stinkhorn does anyway, and the dog stinkhorn. And they produce a rank smell on their cap, which attracts flies. So it's a different strategy for getting their spores into the air. They don't drop them and catch the air. They attract flies, and you normally smell these guys long before you see them. I actually saw some remains of these just 2 days ago. I was astonished because it's really late in the season to be seeing them. So that's actually quite a common mushroom in the UK, the common stinkhorn. There's rarer, weirder things called the devil's fingers and the ballerina stinkhorn, which has this beautiful petticoat on it as well. I think it's all designed to direct flies onto the air spore-bearing surface at the top. Devil's fingers is pretty cool. That's quite rare in the UK. I think you were doing some Halloween mushrooms, weren't you, Isha? Did you include devil's fingers?
I think actually I don't know. I did. I think I had a limit on 5. So
You're right. Okay.
These ones are brilliant.
Well, it's the names of mushrooms are as enchanting as their forms, and the mycelium. They do have these extraordinary names. We'll see a few more of it in the next slide, probably. Yeah. Oh, yes. These guys. No, I've never found one of these. These are tiny. These are incredibly cute. They're called bird's nest fungi, and they are just little cups. Tiny, you can see, like smaller than a little bit of your nail, and quite often buried or half buried in leaf litter. Really quite hard to see. And yeah, that's on top of my must-see list. And they bear their spores on these little kind of pills that sit in the cups. And when the raindrops come in, they just splash them out, and the spores get splashed out. So yeah, if you find any of them, then take a nice photo. They're pretty. I don't know if they're terribly rare. They're fairly rare, but they're definitely very hard to see. And what happens a lot with recording of fungi is that it's the ones that are easy to spot that get recorded more, but it's not necessarily always the most common, because the most common ones may be tiny or microscopic. So, but these guys are, yeah, worth keeping an eye out for. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then we have the crust fungi, or the corticoid fungi. Some of these are very common. We've got these orange crust-like fungi that form on dead branches and things, and like we've got on the bottom and the left there, the hairy curtain crust. And rarer things around me, there's loads of this one called pink disco, but apparently it's quite scarce nationwide in the UK. But you'll find that on fallen beech twigs, and it forms this beautiful crust, pink crust. It doesn't form a bracket or stick out off the mushroom at all. It just forms this crust. Pink disco and midnight disco. Aren't the names amazing?
Brilliant.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then we have bracket fungi. So this is the mushrooms that have given up having a stem, and they will grow out the side of a tree. Often they are feeding on the wood. They may be parasitic, or on rotten, dying or dead wood, and they grow out as a shelf. But essentially what they're doing is using the tree or the host as not only food, but as to get them up in the air. So when their spores drop out, they're going to catch the air, and they've got greater coverage. So some fairly famous ones here. The birch polypore is one that you see right through the winter. If you've got some birch woods near you, this will be on. We're getting a bit old and green by now, maybe, but it grows out, juts out of birch trees. Very common in birch woodlands. Oyster mushrooms, of course, they're a mushroom that is actually farmed nowadays quite extensively. You'll see them in delicatessens and even supermarkets now. And that's because they have a very diverse appetite and can grow on all sorts of different things, from dead wood to bales of hay and various different things. So yeah, these are the bracket fungus that are like shells coming out of the tree.
It is grey oyster mushrooms that go out in our fungus labs every year, so very handy.
You grow lots of them, do you?
Yeah, our fungus labs that get sent out, we send out thousands of them. It's the grey oyster mushrooms that they grow.
Yeah. Wow, lovely. Yeah, they're beautiful. That one in the photo there doesn't quite do it justice, but that was about 1.5 foot across. It was the biggest oyster mushroom I'd ever seen, and it was pure white. Really, really interesting. There are different strains of oyster mushroom, but this was truly spectacular. Really ghostly white in the forest. Yeah. Next slide, please. Then we. Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I've skipped ahead one.
Easily done. Yeah, then we get these kind of weird and wonderful, beautiful gems like clubs and corals. Yeah, and for all the world, like a coral in a coral reef, golden spindles and golden stag's horn. Yeah, gorgeous stuff. Again, not rare. The golden stag's horn, quite common on if you go into coniferous forest or even plantations on the old stumps. They will grow on those, and they're very beautiful. My friend calls it Lego fire, because if you get these big Lego sets, you know, the Harry Potter ones or whatever, and they've got a fireplace, that apparently that's what Lego fire looks like. They're quite small. Next slide, please. And then the gooey stuff, the jelly fungi. I think you had some of these in your Halloween rundown. Leafy brain fungus, yellow brain fungus, black bulgur. Yeah, big sludgy, slimy things, but quite fascinating. And actually, after the storm, I was walking around my local woods, and there was quite a lot of the leafy brain fungus, which quite often grows high up in trees, had been blown off, and there was these sort of sludgy brains lying around on the ground. So sometimes if you're trying to identify mushrooms, you might think they're growing on the ground, but they've like fallen out of a tree or something like that. So it's worth looking up to see if there's more as well. Okay, and I think that is most of our different basic forms of fungi. But where's a good place to go and look? If those of you that did the session on recording and journaling, where to go to actually encounter mushrooms? Well, if you're looking for the mycorrhizal fungi, there are 4 main tree types in the UK that are really good to look under, and that's beech, birch, oak, and I've said pine here, but generally most conifers are highly mycorrhizal and form lots of relationships with different things. So called conifers in general as one of the big 4 tree types. All of these species, so if you've got a mixed oak beechwood with some birch trees around the side and the odd pine, then you're going to see a huge variety of fungi. The tree types to avoid in general, if you're looking for mycorrhizal fungi anyway, would be sycamore and ash. You'll very rarely find, or there's not very many fungi at all growing in association with them. Certainly not mycorrhizal fungi.
Good advice.
Yeah. And where to find mushrooms? Also in unimproved grassland, and I've emphasised unimproved grassland. You're not going to find these down on your local football pitch, or you're unlikely to, unless you live maybe in the West Highlands of Scotland, and we have some pretty rough football pitches out here. But generally, if anyone's put any nitrogen enhancement on the grass, or silage fields, or any of that kind of intensive agricultural grass growing that goes on, it's a death knell to most types of mushroom and fungi. So yeah, what you're really looking for is these upland grasslands, hill pastures, rough grazing, and very good is the lawns of old stately homes. They're particularly interesting for a really interesting group of mushrooms called the wax caps. So they have this greasy, waxy kind of texture on the cap, but the most beautiful colours. And of course, these are the places where you're going to find the classic mushroom, edible mushroom that people think about is the horse mushrooms and field mushrooms, those classic mushroom types, and the hallucinogenic liberty cap there as well. These are the habitats where you'd find those. Next slide, please. Yes, and the other place to look is fallen wood. Of course, we covered this earlier, and time's getting on now. We don't need to go into too much detail again, but these are the parasitic mushrooms that are growing on dead or fallen wood. And if you ever see a big fallen tree, then think of it like a dead animal on the savannah, okay? And there's going to be a succession of predators coming to eat off that. You know, maybe the lions first, and then the hyenas, or maybe the other way around, and then the smaller cats, and then the smaller dogs, and then the vultures, and then the rodents, and things like that. Well, fungi are no different. One fungi will open up a niche for the next one that will do, and then it will recede. So there's competition for those resources. So there'll be a succession of different mushrooms appearing. Next slide, please. How are we doing for time?
We are getting very close to the end, unfortunately. I could listen to you talk all day.
Yeah, I think we'll get through, you know, wonderful to get through all your content, Mark. I think we've had so many amazing questions come in that I know we're not going to have time to cover, but we can perhaps follow up with some people afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Well, this slide already is just going over what we mentioned earlier on, leaf and needle and the rotting fungus. So leaf and needle litter is really good. So we're going straight on to the next one. It'd be good to do a little bit now about identifying mushrooms. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, how to go about identifying the mushrooms that you do come across. I think the main message that I teach repeatedly when I take up my guided mushroom walks in the autumn is that it's difficult, and you probably know that already if you're watching this. We have reports vary, depends how you measure them, but approximately 15,000 fungi recorded in the UK, and only if 7,000 of them are visible with the naked eye, and that's more than there are flowering plants. Okay, so that's a lot to get through, and even about a third of them, those visible 7,000 visible fungi, you would need a microscope to identify them. And the lady in the photo on the left here is a lovely Scottish mycologist called Liz, and you know, she and I identified about 100 different species of mushrooms in the survey once. She identified most of them. She's much better than me, but she needed a microscope to do about a third of them. Okay, so you have to kind of manage your expectations about what's possible with the naked eye. Next slide, please. Yeah, and you'll definitely need a book, probably more than one if you really want to get into it. These are some that I would recommend. The one on the left is the kind of classic identification guide by Roger Phillips, a good one to have at home. You know, really good photographic guide. And then we've got this one. The second one is really good for getting you into the right family group. It's actually a little pamphlet. You can get it online. It's about 10 quid. It's called an initial guide to the identification of mushrooms and toadstools. It won't tell you what species you have, but it's like a key, not like a plant or flower key for mushrooms, and it'll help you get it into the right family group. So that's really good. It's a little flow chart. And then the third one I would highly recommend, just as a good read at home, is this it came out last year, Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And that is not an ID guide, but that is how to really understand a lot of the things we've been talking about today about mycelium, how mushrooms grow, what they do, all the amazing things that they do, and where the science is at. But it's really in a very accessible form. And if you're thinking that my copy there looks a little bit worse for wear, that's something that Merlin, the author, did. He actually inoculated a copy of his book with oyster mushroom mycelium, and grew oyster mushrooms out of it, and then cooked the oyster mushrooms and ate his words.
That's fantastic. I thought it was just like an illustration. I didn't realize it was actually what he did. Wow.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Next slide, please. So yeah, I thought we'd just kind of wrap up by putting together a portrait of the terminology and observations you need in order to go about identifying mushrooms. And there are quite a few things to put together here. First of all, cap color. You think that might be obvious, but color can change quite quickly through time with mushrooms. So by the way, this is the fly agaric, the iconic mushroom that we're looking at here. I'm just using this as an example because it illustrates lots of the kind of features of mushrooms that you might encounter. It has all of them. Some mushrooms wouldn't have as many different features. So you think about what cap color, and these are the things you need to record and cross-reference in your book, or however you're doing your research, if you want to identify a mushroom. Okay, and the next is, what's underneath the cap? Okay, so what's going on underneath the cap? Has it got gills like slats, which is the classic kind of mushroom? Some have pores, some have spines. What color are they? They're probably a different color from the cap. And how are they attached to the stem? Do they run down the stem? So you might be familiar with the chanterelle, which has this vase-like appearance where the gills run down the stem, whereas our fly agaric here, the gills don't really touch the stem at all, they just hang down. These are really important observations that will help you to identify a mushroom. And next slide, next transition, thank you. Yeah, spores, we haven't even touched on it. Well, mentioned spores with a business end, it's everything the mushroom is about. And they have different colours and they have different shapes. You would need a microscope to observe them. And if you get into, you know, really advanced mushroom identification, you start to look at spore shape is a really good way of identifying mushrooms. But you can just look at the colour of the spores as they come out. Next, yeah. What's going on the stem? There might be a ring zone, like this hanging little skirt. Is it there? Is there one? Maybe there isn't one. Maybe it's a big frilly one. Maybe it's just some fine little cobwebs. So lots of things to look at there as well. Next transition, please. And the stem, what is its shape and what is its colour and texture? Is it firm? Is it floppy? Is it stringy? Is it crumbly? Lots of things to think about there in terms of the kind of general feel of a mushroom. Yes, and actually I touched on that there, the texture. There's a whole family of mushrooms called brittle gills that have brittle flesh all over and they crumble like sugar cubes. You know, if you rub them in your hand, but others will be really tough. So your texture is going to help you with your identification. Next transition, please. Yep, and what's going on at the base? This family in particular, the Amanita family, very important observations at and even below ground level that will help you to identify the mushroom. So very kind of, you know, precise features to look out for. And very importantly, we've touched on this quite a lot already, what is it growing with? This is called substrate. So is it leaf litter? Is it growing out of a tree? You know, is it growing out of a pine cone? You know, there's lots of things that tie in with those nutritional lifestyles of fungi. So all of these together brings together your portrait of a mushroom. And these are the things, if you want to ID them, you need to record them as you observe the mushroom and then cross-check that with your book. Next slide, please. And just to say, I don't want to make this any more complicated than it might seem already, but cap shape changes really quickly. And this is what catches people out most. This is all the different pictures at different times of the same mushroom. And you can see in day 2, it's a little button. Day 4, it's kind of opened out and it's got this lovely umbrella shape. Day 7, it's flat. It might even start turning up at that stage, and then there should be another picture beyond that where it starts to disintegrate. That might only be in 10 days time. So it's really quite quick growth, quick changing, quick process. It's the biggest challenge with mushroom identification, and knowing kind of that you need to sort of observe a few different examples of the same species to get a real feel for what's going on. I wish I could make it easier. If you are taking photos of mushrooms, a really good way to record what you're seeing, it's not useful to take a top of the head shot, I call it. It's a little bit like, as I've illustrated here, saying, who's this person? You can only see the top of their head. You've seen already in that portrait how many things are going on under the cap. So you need to get a side-on shot, or make some notes when you're there and record as much as you can about the mushroom. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I've just summarized here how to take useful ID photos. I'll be honest, I get sent lots of bad photos of mushrooms saying, what is this? And I've made this so I can just send it to people quite quickly to help them know what is required, So these are all the things together, and we've covered most of these, that would help us to identify a mushroom. So yeah, I think that's, we're getting towards the end now. It'd be nice to answer some questions. I hope we're not running too far over time.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I think we're just coming to the questions. Here we go. Yeah. Right, well, we've had loads come in, so we're not going to get through very many, I'm afraid, but I'm going to pick a few that have been dripping in, some ones that have been popular. Let's have a little look. Mike Dickinson said, I only seem to find fungi in the UK during the damp autumn months. Shouldn't there be fungi all year round? So I just wondered if you had any thoughts to share on that, Mark.
Yeah, no, that's an accurate observation. So I would say about 80% maybe of the observable fungi that we're talking about here only really appear, the mushrooms I should say. Remember, the mycelium is quite likely there for the whole year, but it's invisible. But it's is the mushrooms that 80% or so would appear in autumn. You know, usually in Scotland, the autumn starts when spring ends. Normally, we don't normally get a summer, but we did this year. But yeah, normally a drop in temperature around about September, a little bit later if you're in the south of England, and a drop in temperature will trigger that mushroom growth. So yeah, autumn is the main season. The main reason for that is because it's the production of these reproductive structures is a stress reaction by the mycelium that is saying, oh right, it's suddenly got cold, it's going to get cold, it's going to be winter, my tree partner might blow down, I've eaten all these dead leaves, whatever's going on there, and now I need to get more spores into the air in case. So it's like an insurance policy to reach new areas. So yeah, autumn is the time, but you can definitely observe mushrooms all year round. You just have to look a little bit harder at other times.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. Another really interesting question, which I don't know whether you'll be able to answer, but Jabe, age 32, says, do you get mycelium in the human body?
Whoa.
It's a bit creepy, that one. But
well, yeah. The classic one that springs to mind is athlete's foot. That is a fungal infection. You know, fungi like kind of wet, damp, kind of moist bits. So yeah, and you know, so there are some things. I think there's things like thrush is maybe a yeast infection. That's a fungal infection as well. So yes, definitely. They will attack humans. But what's really interesting, the fungal species, there's a whole group of fungi that attack insects and they zombify insects, the cordyceps group of mushrooms, and their spores actually kind of control the mind of insects. We can't start down that road now for a short time, but anyway, look into them. But they do parasitize and control insects and use them as part of their thing and kill them. What's really interesting is it's terrifying when you look into that world. It's like, well, what if a mushroom evolves that does that to humans? And there's all sorts of like films and comic books about what might happen if that happened. But the main reason that they don't is our body temperature is just slightly too high for most fungi to cope with. So that's what keeps us safe from these guys. But yeah, if we'd evolved like, you know, to live at a few degrees cooler, then we might have all sorts of things yeah, after us.
Yeah, that sounds very nightmarish. So
yeah.
terrifying. Oh,
yeah.
I'm going to finish with this one question that we've got from Bean age 10 and Bud age 9, which is a great question, probably very difficult to answer. What is your favorite fungi?
Oh my goodness. Oh yes. Oh, I've got so many. It's so difficult. It's like choosing a favorite child. There is an amazing mushroom called hen of the woods, Grifola frondosa, and it grows at the base, usually of oak trees, old oak trees, and it grows quite enormous, and it has all these overlapping kind of shelves and brackets and wavy brackets, and it looks like a hen's tail feathers. And it's big and it's beautiful and it's just gorgeous when you see it. And it's called, in Japanese, they call it maitake, which translates to the dancing mushroom. And that's because when you find it, it's just so wonderful to find it, you do a little dance. So yeah, I think that's my favorite, but I could give you loads of favorites.
I bet. Right, so really sadly, we're going to have to finish there. But if you would like to find out any more, next slide, please.
It's coming.
There we go. If you'd like to find out more, I cannot recommend enough Mark's website, GallowayWildFoods.com, which has a wealth of really, really fascinating resources and blog posts, some which have been mentioned, as well as webinars, which, as I said, this was just touching on some of the amazing information you can find out. There are a lot more detailed webinars there that you can access. So I would really recommend having a look at that and connecting with Mark on his social media channels at Mark Wild Food, on his Twitter, on his Facebook at Galloway Wild Foods, and Instagram at Mark Wild Food. But also, next slide, please. You can obviously come and join us on our Grow Wild website, and we again have a lot of fungi resources there and quizzes and accessible information for you to have a read and a watch of. And again, same with the social media channels. Please come and join us and tag us in any of your brilliant fungi finds. If you're going to do some nature journaling now with your new fungi observational skills and ID skills, then please do tag us in our Instagram at Grow Wild UK, or our Facebook at Grow Wild UK also, or our Twitter, same hash, same tag. If the recording, as I said, will be on our YouTube channel come next week. You'll also be able to catch up on our last session, and yeah, that is it. If we have any more questions, we will really try and get some of the questions in maybe some blog posts in the coming weeks. But it's been really great to have you all here. I hope you've learned something. I know I've been sitting here smiling hugely and learning so much. So yes, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Mark. And I think perhaps we might need a follow-up session. If you're anybody out there is keen for a follow-up session with Mark, please do let us know, because I think, judging by your questions, you've got loads more you'd like to ask Mark about. So do let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.